and welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker. And our special guest today is Professor Dennis Olson. Dennis is the Charles Haley Professor of Old Testament Emeritus, just recently retired from Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. And the author of a number of books, particularly in the Pentateuch. He has a book on Numbers and one on Deuteronomy, and is writing another book on the theology of Exodus. So welcome, Dennis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you.
Good. And we should mention you're also Lutheran, so you're a Lutheran pastor as well. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So part of our clan. So thank you for being here.
I did my MDiv at Luther Seminary.
So for this episode, we have a question from a listener. And as usual, if you have a question for us that you'd like addressed on this podcast, feel free to go to enterthebible.org and send us that question. So the question for today is, what is the significance of the Sabbath commandment for believers, and how should it be observed today? And we're assuming from that this listener is talking specifically about Christian believers rather than Jewish believers. So we shortened the question to, do Christians have to keep the Sabbath? So Dennis, how would you begin to address that question?
Yeah, so I begin, I guess, by thinking about what the Sabbath is and its sort of deeper meanings, and then think about how this commandment that is in the book of Exodus and in Deuteronomy, as part of the Jewish scriptures, which is also the Old Testament part of the Christian scriptures, how that does or does not apply to Christians. And so it's a really good question. And in fact, there are different denominations and traditions within Christianity that look somewhat differently at the Sabbath and that question. But it'd be interesting to explore the range of that. I guess the way to begin that is to recognize that the Sabbath is part of the 10 commandments. So the big 10
Yes.
are the top 10 commandments, right? And they're highlighted in the early books of the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, in Exodus 20, when God makes a covenant with the people and lays out first on 2 tablets, written, as the text says, by the finger of God, as a way of highlighting their importance. And among those 10 commandments is the commandment to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And there are other commandments that go along with that, that explicate that Sabbath commandments, explain it, expand upon it in various ways. In Exodus 20 and then in Deuteronomy 5, those same 10 commandments are repeated again by Moses, who's about to die and wants to pass on what is most crucial in the book of Deuteronomy to the next generation. So all of those ways highlight the importance of the 10 commandments, and then the Sabbath commandment is part of those 10. So there's a significance to it that just by inclusion in those 10 commandments. And I would also say that within the structure of the 10 commandments itself, the Sabbath commandment plays a particularly important role. The first commandments begin with obligations to God. You shall have no other gods. Don't take the name Lord God in vain. No idols, worshiping, and so forth. And then the Sabbath commandment comes. And then what follows the Sabbath commandment are commandments having to do with our relationships to our neighbors. So honor your father and mother, your family members. Do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not covet, do not bear false witness, and so on. But the Sabbath commandment sits sort of right in between there, and is in many ways, it seems to me, a kind of intersection point, because the notion of resting on the seventh day, the Sabbath day, and working the other 6 days, but resting on the seventh day, is a commandment that has to do with obligations to God. It's a time to gather and worship to God. but it also has to do with obligations to others, that is, to family members, to workers, to ensure that they rest, even animals.
Right.
So the Sabbath commandment is the one of the 10 that has sort of ecological dimension to it as well, to non-human creation. And there's a expansion of that, even letting the land rest in Leviticus 25, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So it's the relationships then to God, but also to our neighbor, and to non-human creation, but also even to ourselves. I mean, it's for our own good, right? So all of that intersection of network of relationships in which we live are in some way captured in the Sabbath commandment. And the Sabbath commandment is the longest in terms of number of words of all. All the others are relatively quite short, but the Sabbath commandment is much more extensive. And so all of that as a way to sort of highlight the significance of the Sabbath commandment.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. It's when I teach the 10 Commandments, I talk about it as a kind of hinge command, right? Just as you said, right? It's about the vertical dimension of our relationship with God, but also about that horizontal dimension of relationship with the community, and
Exactly.
even as you say, the natural world as well.
Yeah.
But there are two different reasons given for the Sabbath, right, Dennis? One in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's in Exodus 20, the reason that's given is that God created the world in 7 days and rested in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day, referring back to the creation story in Genesis 1. And in chapter 2, verses 1-3, God rests on the seventh day. And so, in a sense, God sort of creates the framework of time, sun and the moon and stars, and provides a framework of 7 days. And interestingly, God enters into that framework of time and rests on the seventh day from all the work that God had done in creating the world. What's interesting about that is that creation stories in the ancient world of surrounding Israel, great empires that had creation stories, the creation stories would often end with the building of a temple to the high God, who was the sort of patron god to the king, the ruler of the empire. And the creation stories functioned as a way of declaring who's in charge. and it's the high God, but it's the king,
right?
Who is the sort of representative of the God. And in Genesis 1, in many ways, it's a declaration that not only given territory or empire or nation or collection of nations belongs to the ruler who is God, but the whole creation belongs to God. And there is a kind of what the Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel describes as God, Sabbath as a temple in time in that creation story. And so it's God's, in some sense, has created the whole creation as God's temple, but also in space, but also in the temple of the Sabbath. And so God builds into all of creation, all of God's creatures, this need for regular rest. And God sort of becomes a kind of pedagogical model of how to do that. After the end of 6 days of working, you rest. Now that raises a theological question: does God need to rest, really?
Does God rest? Is that when all the bad things happen? When God's taking his day off?
Maybe, yeah, that's right. Yeah, takes the day off. That's right. Oh, that's why it happens. And what's interesting, in Exodus, I think it's 31, it says God rested on the Sabbath, and God was refreshed, it says. So, it's, so how do I understand that? For me, the way to understand that, thinking about the nature of God theologically, is that it's not that God needs to rest, but it is that the resting on the seventh day of creation was God's sort of first step of accommodating God's self to the structures of existence in the world, a kind of first step towards the incarnation. And you read the stories of Jesus, who's fully human, fully divine. Jesus needs to rest, right? Sometimes crowds are overwhelming. Jesus had to sleep. He's on the boat with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. The storm comes, and Jesus is sleeping. And then the disciples say, "Hey, wake up, wake up!" And Jesus wakes up, calms everything, and Jesus says, "Don't be afraid," and that in some ways reflects both the humanity of Jesus needing rest, but also the sort of creational sovereignty of God over all creation, embodied even in Jesus as well. And that image of the boat, the sort of inverted ship, is often an image associated with church buildings, right? The big, inside the hull of an upside down ship that's been turned over. And there's a sense in which gathering on the Sabbath for worship as a community of God is a way by which we come together to sort of right ourselves in the midst of the storms and challenges and waves that knock us around during the other 6 days of the week of work and life and all that hits us, and gets us reoriented once again, helps us remember who we are, whose we are, and the priorities and the values that we have.
I love that. I think I learned that from you, actually, Dennis, when you came to Luther to give a lecture several years ago, that contrast between that sanctuary, that physical sanctuary at the end of many ancient Near Eastern myths. But here it's a sanctuary in time. And
Yes.
that's really beautiful, that, a time set apart, consecrated. And
Yeah.
I like your connection of it with Jesus in the boat sleeping as well. That
Yeah.
it's in our 24/7 news cycle world, right? where we make even play work, right? When with kids, youth, soccer leagues or hockey leagues or whatever, right? I mean, we're always going, even when we're supposed to be, even when we're having fun.
Yeah.
to
Yes.
think about that kind of boundaried space, right? That sanctuary in time, I think, is a really beautiful reminder to us of how God, as you say, who we are and whose we are.
Well, and you raise a very important question about the culture of time that we live in. There was a book entitled "The Geography of Time" by Richard Levine, and in which he studied the cultures of time across the world, in many different cultures, and he noted, that each culture had its own sort of unique temporal fingerprint. It's unique understanding of time. And in the West, industrialized nations, sort of fast-paced, fast food, instant messages,
Right.
trying to squeeze everything out of productive workers, and valuing 24/7 availability. And then you put on top of that technology and the sort of ways in which we are tied to computers and to cell phones, all which serve good purposes, but can also sort of draw us into an always on-call kind of state where and so the importance, even in that sense, of withdrawing for our own well-being,
Yeah.
um, and being in face-to-face community with one another. And sociologists have noted how we Americans tend to work more hours and sleep less, so we're more tired, and that's not a healthy thing. And the Sabbath, I think, reminds us we're not created for that 24/7 kind of work, and we need time for play, creativity, for building relationships with God, with one another, meditating ourselves, prayer. The Hebrew word Shabbat, which is from the root to stop, to interrupt the routine.
Right.
That's what's at the
really?
core
That's what that means?
of the Sabbath.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah. Huh. I didn't know that.
So
Shabbat means just stop. Yeah.
Yes.
With the connotation of rest. Yeah.
Right.
That's cool.
And the need for that regularly, to stop and sort of reassess what are our priorities, what are our values, and what gives us true joy and fulfillment, and all of that is very important. So my wife teaches computers and technology at an elementary school. She's done that for almost 40 years, from the very beginning of the use of technology in education until now. And she's been, throughout that time, cognizant of the need not to let that rule our lives, but to use it when it's useful, but to put it away when it's not.
Let me ask you both a couple of questions I've always been curious about, actually. So,
Here we go.
I'm going to bow to Dennis.
Yeah, well,
No.
Dennis knows better. Okay, Dennis knows best. But so one thing I appreciate in the kind of listener's question, like, I'm hearing all these wonderful things about the Sabbath and why we should keep Sabbath. And yet, as Christians, a couple of things. One is, Shabbat literally means, you said stop, but it also then became the literal day, Saturday, right? So it's like actually this day, Saturday.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in some ways, it feels like the only one of the 10 commandments that maybe we don't take as seriously, or, we moved it to Sunday theoretically. So I'm curious about that. And then I'm curious about this text in Colossians 2. So it says, I'm reading out of the NIV, Colossians 2:16. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. So is the argument there Sabbath doesn't matter anymore? Or if it does matter, why don't, I go to brunch after church on Sundays a lot of times. Am I sinning? Should I literally observe Sabbath on Saturday instead of Sunday? Did it actually get transferred to Sunday? Is it still binding? Is it not? Help.
Yeah.
Maybe
Excellent.
If I could add, let me add one other thing, and then this is all you, Dennis. No.
Okay.
I think probably more familiar stories from the New Testament about Sabbath are all the Sabbath controversies, right? Where Jesus heals on the Sabbath or allows his disciples to pick grain on the Sabbath. I didn't remember that text from Colossians, Katie, but that's a really interesting one to talk about too. And Jesus basically says, he does say, humankind is made, or the Sabbath is made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So,
and Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath.
Right.
So,
Okay,
Dennis, how do I be a good person and follow the commandments so I can go to heaven? Go ahead.
There you go. That's right. And just to complicate it further, there is a law in Exodus 31 that says that anyone who does not keep the Sabbath should be put to death.
Oh, right.
Which is,
There's also that one.
Serious?
Yeah.
Okay, they take it. Okay, so that's
very serious. Yeah.
Yes, so that's exactly right. So let's start with Saturday to Sunday. Some of that is can be helped to be understood, remembering the context in which the early followers of Jesus were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. Disciples were Jewish. So they would be observing Jewish laws. And in some of those early Jewish Christian communities, and they would go to synagogue, but then they also felt a need as believers in Jesus, different from other Jews, that they needed also to meet. And so they would meet on the first day of the week, which would be what we call Sunday. And the first day of the week, Sunday, was also associated with the day of Jesus' resurrection, Easter Sunday, on Good Friday and Saturday, and then Sunday, the resurrection. So that became a sort of holy day. But then as the community of believers in Jesus began to, through Paul's ministry and the like, began to expand into non-Jewish communities and Gentiles, then the issue became, do Gentile Christians have to follow all of the Jewish laws, which involved, as Colossians says, the festivals, what you eat and drink, and purity laws, and also the Sabbaths. So those non-Jewish Gentile believers in Jesus could, Colossians is saying, not go on the Sabbath day, right, to Jewish synagogue. That's not their obligation, and you're free from that. But presumably would want to gather together with community of those who believed in Jesus, both Jews and Gentiles, as it became mixed together along the way. And then as over time, Jewish communities began to separate from those who followed Christ, whether Jews or Gentiles, and thus the Sunday, the first day of the week, became the primary time of gathering together. So that's some of the sort of historical background that helps us understand what happens. And then you get Constantinople and the Christian Empire, and that sort of imposes that sort of framework of time, 7 days, and Sunday becomes a Christian Sabbath for much of that, of those people, populations of that time. But so, and then you have, like in Galatians, Paul writes about being freed from the yoke. That's, again, addressing this question of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and Gentiles not having to feel obligated to that. So that opened up the possibility of being, seeing the Sabbath as having it on Sunday, but also not having the same sort of strictness in keeping the Sabbath in all the ways in which Jews understood that. I mean, in the book of Exodus, you have there and other places in the Old Testament quite clear indications of things that count as work that you should not do on the Sabbath. So no commerce or trade, no animals should carry burdens, you shouldn't carry burdens, you shouldn't start a fire or cook.
Or go
as
to
a matter of fact,
brunch, probably.
Or go to brunch either. Or, you should.
No mimosas.
But you still have to eat food, right? I mean, so so in the Orthodox Jewish community, they have all ways of, like, they have Sabbath ovens that turn on by themselves, so you can not technically, click a switch on, which creates a spark, which is like lighting a fire, which you're not supposed to do. But if it turns on by itself, it's fine. Or a Sabbath elevator is where you, on Sabbath day, it stops at every floor, so you don't have to punch a button to get up to your apartment on the 13th floor or whatever.
Wow.
So there are ways in which, and what's great about that is taking the Sabbath seriously. It's the discipline. Okay, we're committed to this, and it's good for us, and it's important for us, and we can learn something from that sort of concern, because the Sabbath is really a rich sort of concept, and the priority of it particularly in the time of biblical Israel, became more and more important as Israel went into exile and people lived in diaspora in other communities. It was the observance of the Sabbath that set them apart, and that in many ways defined their temple of time, right? The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, but they in time had their own temple, the Sabbath, gathering and worship, the Torah, and prayer became central to the life that was there, and that's what gave them identity and gave them perspective and set their priorities about who they were as God's people, even though they didn't feel totally at home where they may have been. So, in that sense, for us as people of Christian faith, to have that sense of the distinctiveness of the Sabbath as a time which, setting aside a day, and a day that's oriented towards worship of God, gathering as God's community, caring for one another, and caring for God's creation and enjoying it, being more playful and free. Throughout the Old Testament, you have texts that talk about the delight in the Sabbath. It makes us happy. So it's meant to be a joyous time. So it's a commandment, but it's a very friendly commandment. Work for 6 days and then take a day off.
Take a break.
Right? And you are commanded to take a day off. Okay. We could welcome that. And that becomes an important sort of discipline. But I think it's broader than that. That I think in many ways, the rich festival life, the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals in ancient Israel, the new moons, and then the weekly Sabbaths, all of those were sort of interruptions in time throughout the year, throughout a given month, throughout a week. And I would say even within a day, we can take Sabbath time of just some quiet prayer, meditation, quiet time visiting a good friend, having a meal together, and carving out those, whether in the day, in the week, month, or year. All of those are Sabbath interruptions that help sort of reorient us again to what gives us real joy, what gives us meaning and purpose in our lives. And I think more globally, a book like the Book of Ecclesiastes, which you might not associate with the Sabbath, it doesn't talk much about worship, but it talks about what is ephemeral, what is vanity of vanities, chasing after riches, after power, after fame. No, it's the little small joys in life of eating and drinking with friends, with family, with the one you love. And those give us sort of lasting joys that some of the endless chasing after that sometimes our culture encourages or it sort of imposes or expects of us to be always working, always moving forward, always trying to achieve, trying to compete, all of that. I think a Sabbath truth about human existence is that we begin our life with nothing and we end our life with nothing. And we end at the same sort of finish line. And so all the striving in between, the Sabbath says, remember who you are. You're a human being. You're a limited human being under God, the Creator, and the importance of trusting God to care for us, to take a day at a time. And Jesus spoke of God's care for the sparrows and God has counted each of your hairs in your head. God knows what you need. So let the day's troubles be sufficient for the day. That's a kind of Sabbath
Matthew
attitude.
6, yeah.
Yeah, yes.
No,
Yeah.
that's really lovely, Dennis. I think what I hear you saying, we ask the question, do Christians have to keep the Sabbath? I think what you're saying is Christians get to keep the Sabbath, right? Like
Yeah.
that
Why
Sabbath.
wouldn't you?
Right,
Right.
exactly. That
It's
Sabbath
Right.
is a gift, that the
yeah,
Sabbath commandment is actually a gift for life, for flourishing, for health, for rest. I mean, it really is a beautiful concept that I think we ignore to our detriment.
Maybe some of the precise, like, this day, or how many steps, or, can you turn your oven on? Those sorts of things might not be part of what we as Gentile Christians, right, are obligated to keep, but the deeper commandment of not letting our work or our busyness or our obligation, whatever, rule our lives, but instead to take time to rest and to be sure to encourage others to rest if we are business owners or leaders, right? To make sure
Yeah,
our
yeah,
people
yeah,
know that we value for them rest, and
yeah,
like all of those kinds of things. That is keeping the Sabbath, um, even though the precise kind of guidelines may not apply to us.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it's living out of a relationship with God that is based in God's faithfulness and grace, and receiving the gift of life, which is a temporary gift or given for a time. And the Ten Commandments begin with a declaration: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And so these are commandments that invite us into freedom, um, and serving God, but finding a vocation with meaning and purpose, and joy, through all the struggles and the wilderness and the chaos that is also life as well.
yeah,
Well,
it
you've
really is.
convinced me,
Thank you so much.
Dennis. I need to repent. I don't do
Yeah.
great at keeping this commandment.
No, we all do. I mean, that's,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
absolutely. There is in the book of Exodus a place where the Sabbath plays an important role in the story of manna in Exodus
Yeah.
16, where
Oh,
Israel
sure, yeah.
comes out of Egypt, having been, and Egypt was the iron furnace, as Deuteronomy calls it,
Right.
of working 7 days, no days off, uh, every day, and squeezing production of the bricks out of the Israelites relentlessly. And then God frees them from that slavery, that bondage, that sort of enslaving work. They come into the wilderness, they need water and they need food. God gives them water. And then for the food, God sends them manna, which they gather over the course of the 6 days of the week. And the story, it's very interesting. Some of the people go out and gather, and they work really hard and are very energetic and gathering as much manna as they can. And then some people are a little bit, lackadaisical about gathering them. But at the end of the day, they all have the same amount, whether they,
Yeah.
worked really hard or a little not as hard. And then the 6th day, they get, however hard they work, they get twice as much. God ensures they get twice as much, so they have plenty for the Sabbath day. They don't have to work on the Sabbath. But then the text says, of course, some of them went out on the 7th day anyway, and they gathered more manna, but that just all went bad, and that didn't work. And there's, I think, a sort of an economic structure of understanding of how life can flourish best, in the sense of we say the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, That's one day at
Yeah.
a time. What's
Yeah.
sufficient?
We're not
We don't
hoarding
have
it. Yeah.
Yes, and we don't have to live out of fear that we don't have enough. God's not going to give us enough, but a sense of trust. And it's not easy to do.
Right.
And so
Right.
as you said, Katie, we keep repenting, right? But it always calls us, the sort of vision of what Sabbath is, calls us to remember and to live out of a life that receives life as a gift and receives the relationships that we have as gifts that can be shared and that can be enjoyed. And that's the vision that's before us. So we don't have to keep the Sabbath, but it's good for us.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. That was rich, and it answered my question, and I hope it answered the listener's question as well.
I hope so too.
Thank you so much to the person who submitted such a lovely question. And thank you to joining with us today on this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, whether you're listening to us in your favorite podcast app or joining us on YouTube. Please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, for additional awesome reflections and conversations like these, head to enterthebible.org. We've got courses, commentaries, articles, glossaries, maps, anything you could need to deepen your experience with the Bible. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share the podcast with a friend. Thanks for being with us today.